me again, Father Eli here, and now I want to talk a little bit about freedom and two sort of opposing ideas of freedom. So this has to do a lot about our lives, how do we choose to live, and kind of our understanding of how we know what is right and wrong, and all these kinds of things. So uh, there's a writer. He was a Dominican friar. His name was Severus Pincares, kind of an interesting name. He was a Belgian priest, and he wrote about this, trying to kind of recover the real idea of freedom in our world, because over time, freedom has kind of been changed how we think about what it is to be free. So I want to examine one of his articles, or an article about him and his kind of thought. But first, just to talk a little bit about these two kinds of freedom. Freedom of excellence is the first kind. Freedom of excellence, that's the first kind, versus freedom of indifference. So there are two kinds of freedom. So freedom of excellence is the freedom to choose good, choose the good. So what's right, what leads us to God, all those kinds of things. So freedom of excellence is the freedom to choose the good, or the ability to choose the good. Freedom of indifference is the idea that we should have no limits upon our choices, and a limit on a particular choice is a lack of freedom. So freedom, in this sense, is the power to choose indifferently between two opposites, two contraries. So we should be able to choose. So in this idea, freedom is the ability to choose either one and be free in both of them. So we might visit this and talk about it a little bit. I'm going to read some of an article. It's called The Tale of Two Freedoms. So this talks about these two ideas of freedom. I just want to kind of cover some of it and talk about it. So this is an article that was written back in 2017, A Tale of Two Freedoms. So the author says, freedom for excellence is the classical view of freedom. That's the first one, right? The freedom of excellence, which largely predominates almost since the time of Plato and Aristotle. That's way back, really early in time. So 3rd, 4th century BC, before Christ. Maybe even before that. I have to double check my timeline there. But it presupposes that man is naturally ordered to choosing the good, and so he has the capacity to act with excellence as he wishes. So basically we have the capacity and the desire to choose what is good, what is right. It presumes that. This freedom indicates that free will arises from the faculties of intellect, that's the mind, our ability to know, and will, which is the ability to choose. So these two faculties, the intellect is what we have that allows us to know what is right and to understand it, and the will is to be able to choose what is right, or choose the good. So intellect and will help us to know and choose the good. So let's start there again. This freedom indicates that freedom, or free will, arises from the faculties of intellect and will, and from a natural longing for the truth. So within us is this natural desire to know, right? There's a desire to know what is right. So a natural longing for truth, goodness, and joy. Freedom is present in children and develops through education and practice of virtues until it flourishes in maturity. So it's there, right? Every child has this innate, which means a natural desire and ability to know and to desire the good. It unites one's actions into an ordered whole that nourishes human flourishing with its end in authentic human joy. So what is authentic human joy? That might be something to ponder. What do you think it is? What is authentic human joy? What does that look like in our world? What does that look like for you? What would it be to be authentically filled with joy? How do we get there? How do we find that? And wouldn't it be great if the world was ordered to that? That the world was, like everybody in the world was living in such a way that we were all seeking this authentic joy and the flourishing of one another in this joy. So it's not competitive, it's not like you and I. There's only so much joy to be had, and whoever gets it first is going to get it. That's a competitive sort of way of looking at it. Rather, if we work together on this, so we have the common understanding of this, we can find and live this authentic human joy. That's something that this kind of rests upon, that is possible. That is a possible way to live. Continue on in the article. Freedom for excellence, which again is the first form, freedom excellence, was embraced and Christianized at the very early stages of the church. So again, this idea kind of goes back to Aristotle, Plato. They kind of understood what is freedom. It's the freedom to choose the good, to choose what's right. And then the Christian church, the church kind of takes those ideas, which also come from the scriptures, and kind of brings them to the fore and kind of starts to teach on them. So continuing, in fact, Christian teaching greatly strengthened the classical understanding of freedom and virtue. The fall from grace and the disintegration of human intellect, will, and its effects on the appetites and the emotions explains why we experience conflicts in choosing authentic goods. Okay, so here, maybe a couple terms to explain. We already talked about the intellect and the will. The intellect is that sort of rational power. What is a rational power? It's just a power of the mind. So you might say a power of ourselves of the hand is I can grab things, I can manipulate objects, I can change things around me, I can interact with the world on a physical way. So a rational power is a way for the mind to interact. So the intellect is to seek the good, to seek what is right. It tries to understand it, to comprehend it, to pinpoint it and say this is the right thing, this is the highest good, or this is the good thing here. And likewise, it would pinpoint what is wrong or what is evil and what should be avoided. So it can do both of those things. So the intellect helps us to see it and recognize it. And then the will is that rational power. So again, it's a power within us that helps us to choose the good. So to have a strong will, in this sense, would mean that I have a strong ability to choose and to follow what I know to be true, what I know to be good, what I know to be the right thing. So if you have a weak will, you can't avoid temptation. When a temptation comes, you're just like, oh, here it comes, I can't avoid it, I'm going to do it, and you do it, right? So, but if you have a strong will, you can say, here's a temptation, but I know it's not good for me, I'm not going to choose that, because I'm going to go for what I know to be true, what I know to be right, and I'm going to seek that instead. So the will and the intellect are very important because they help us to attain the good. Okay, so the fall from grace and the disintegration of the human intellect and will and its effects explains why we experience conflicts in choosing the authentic goods. So when these things are weakened, when our will and our intellect are weakened and we're not able to act upon them rightly, then we have this fall from grace. We have the weakening of these things keeps us from attaining what is good and attaining what is right. So instead we choose other things. So remember, here it says authentic goods. It helps us to choose authentic goods. And I'm not talking about goods in the sense of objects. I'm talking about goods in the sense of what is right in this situation. So let's give an example. What is the good in a situation might be something like something breaks. I break the lamp and my mother is going to get angry. So I choose to lie because I don't want to face the consequences. Is that a good? Or is it an apparent good? Is it a good thing to lie about breaking the lamp? It's a bad. It's not a good thing, right? So it might appear to be good. So we would say that it's an apparent good, but it's not a true good, authentic good. So to lie in that situation is not to choose the good. To choose the good would be to tell the truth. I broke the lamp. I'm sorry. What can I do to fix this situation? It's maybe more painful in the short run, right? Because I got to face up. I got to fess up to my error, that I broke something. But in the end, which is what we're always focused on as Christians, as Catholics, is what is the end, ultimate ends, and then kind of steps towards that. we want to always remember, what is the end? Where are we going? What is this going to lead me to? So authentic goods are those things that lead us towards the ultimate end, which is eternal life, God, etc. Apparent goods are things that lead us away from those things, but they seem a tempting choice in a moment. Okay, let's continue with the article. It also confirms the universal experience that when apparent goods, most often sensible goods, so apparent goods are things that appear to be good, but they're not really good. They don't really lead me to God and my ultimate end. They lead me away from my ultimate end, or from God. It also confirms the universal experience that when apparent goods, most often sensible goods, are chosen at the expense of the authentic good, the true common good to persons, freedom to choose is lost and replaced by enslavement to poor choices. So what are we getting at here? When we choose poorly, when we choose inauthentic goods, we choose false goods, apparent goods, these are all terms we could use for the good that's not the true good, that leads to slavery. That leads to a lack of freedom. It leads to a place where I can no longer choose the good because I'm enslaved to this poor choice. I'm enslaved to this apparent good. So an example, a very common one today, unfortunately, pornography. People see it, they're exposed to it, unfortunately very young ages many times, and it seems good, right? We're attracted to the human body, especially when it's not covered with clothes. There's something that we're drawn to. And there's something healthy about that in a certain sense. But because of original sin, because of our fallen nature, and right now because of our culture and the way we're trained in our culture very often, our mind is trained, we immediately move to start to use this person. So that's why we have to, unfortunately, we have to wear clothes. We have to protect ourselves from lust. We have to protect ourselves from looking at each other in that way. We have to be careful. So the apparent good is, I'm attracted to this picture or to this video or this image or whatever because there's something that seems good in it. But what happens is when I give into that temptation to start to use this person or this image for my gratification, I'm following what's called an apparent good. It seems to be good, but it's not. And if I keep doing that, I lose my ability to choose the right thing, which is, you are a person, or this is a picture of a true person, and I'm not meant to use you. I'm not meant to take advantage of that. I'm meant to protect that person and uphold their dignity and so forth. That's not mine to take. It's not mine to use. It's not mine to even look at. So we have to be careful. An apparent good draws us, it tempts us, but then it enslaves us, and we're no longer able to say no to it, and that causes us to lose out on the true good, the authentic good. So in this situation, pornography leads to people not being able to commit themselves in marriage. It leads them not to be able to have true intimacy in marriage, or even true intimacy with other people, because whether we're just friends or not, if my mind is trained in this way where I immediately start to lust or to look at people as objects, that leads to a place where we start to really not be able to communicate with one another in a free way. So there's a lot of things that are wrong with pornography, but that's part of it. So this is an example of an apparent good. It seems good, but it eventually leads to enslavement to our poor choices. Okay, let's continue on with the article. Choosing apparent goods, things that seem to be good but there aren't, at the expense of authentic goods results in momentary pleasure. So it's a moment of pleasure, it's a moment of gratification, we kind of like it, it's great in that moment. But the experience eventually gives way to problematic results, such as the loss of self-mastery and self-possession, the acquisition of bad habits, vices, and addictions, as well as physical and psycho-emotional pathologies. Lots of words, it just means it can lead to disorders in our lives where we start to think and act in ways that are not keeping with our order, how God created us to live, to be. We start to train our mind to think in bad ways or to think in wrong ways. And moral decline. So all of this leads us to moral decline, where we can no longer say no to what is going to enslave us, and we're drawn to it rather. So there's kind of a flip of what we're meant to do. So when our will and our intellect are well ordered and they're trained well, we resist temptations to these apparent goods, and we're able to recognize them for what they are and say no to them. And we see authentic goods and we strive after those things, and we take those on and we live those out. So whereas pornography offers us a momentary gratification of the mind, or maybe even of the body, authentic love preserves myself to give myself as a gift to another person and to receive that person as a gift. If we're married, if we enter into that marriage where we give ourselves to one another, that is the authentic thing that I'm saving myself for when I'm living out this chaste love in my life. So living chastity when you're single, like before you're married, means I respect all people. I'm not trying to use anybody. There's this idea these days that, unfortunately, you got to get experienced, or you gotta learn, all these things, so that someday if you do get married, you know what to do, or you're proficient in things. That's a terrible reasoning. That's a terrible way of looking at it. It's an awful way of approaching our sexuality. The gift of our sexuality is meant to be shared with another person in marriage, yes, but to experience that for the first time with your spouse is a great gift. And to be able to continue to unpack that and learn about that as a couple is a beautiful thing. Now, there's a lot of people who have been wounded by all the different things in our world that don't get to experience it in the way we're meant to. And so there's a lot of wounds that need to be healed and unpacked. And it's unfortunately a very common thing today that couples are wounded even before they get married. And so it's a tragic thing. So follow this idea of seeking to train the mind to seek the true good, the authentic good, and preserve yourself. And this is just one area where we would be protected. Okay, let's continue. Sorry, I'm doing lots of off-the-cuff tangents here. Christian teaching of our renewed access to sanctifying grace in and through Christ, and our need to cooperate with this grace, helps to explain the great capacities of the saints to exercise tremendous self-control, to demonstrate consistently heroic moral lives, and the ability to experience joy in even the most difficult of physical and emotional circumstances. What does that mean? A lot of words there. Basically means when we live this authentic way of living where we seek freedom of excellence, it allows us to grow in virtue. It allows us to grow in the ability to say yes to what is truly good, what we were made to be for, how we were made to live, how God designed us. To seek to live that way, to cooperate with the grace that God gives us, because He does give us the grace to live this out. It's not just something we train ourselves, but He offers us the grace to live this out. When we cooperate with that and live that out, not only does it lead us to happiness, to true happiness, but it also gives us the courage, the grace, the ability to overcome challenges and difficulties in our lives that we're going to face. So this is the lives of the saints, right? We see heroic virtue. We see heroic lives, tremendous giving of themselves, able to overcome many sufferings for love of humanity and love of God. So all of these things are important, and they are part of our Christian teaching. Okay, so now we're going to look a little bit into how did this thing get tangled up? How do we give up freedom of excellence and begin to settle for freedom of indifference? How did that happen? Well, it's a long story. I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit in these next parts because, well, some of it's kind of theological, some of it's philosophical, some of it's historical, and I don't know how interesting it would all be to you. But it's very interesting, but maybe for a later date. In the 14th century, so 1400s, speculative thought arose which divorced happiness from the moral life. Okay, that's a pretty big statement. What is speculative thought? It's sort of a way of thinking. It's sort of like the armchair philosopher. You sit in your chair and you think about things and you say, what if this were the case? Or what if that were the case? Or I wonder how this works. Instead of looking at reality, you sort of go through the thought process. Now, this can be helpful in some circumstances, but it can also lead to trouble in other times. So speculative thought arose which divorced happiness and the moral life. That's a problem. So if you don't see that the moral life of the Catholic Church is meant to help you to get to happiness, then the moral life is all it is a bunch of rules that are arbitrary, that could have been another way. If they're divorced, if happiness and the moral life are divorced from one another, that is a huge problem. That's a terrible thing that happens, because now, instead of seeing all these rules, the 10 Commandments, remember we just talked about the 10 Commandments, instead of seeing those things as a way for me to attain happiness, now they just seem arbitrary, and they seem maybe even as an obstacle to my happiness. So this was a really big problem that developed. And this happened over time, and different philosophers and different theologians kind of introduced different parts of that. But one of the big figures in the early part of it was William of Ockham. It's kind of a funny name. William of Ockham, he was a Franciscan theologian, and he kind of developed a different way of thinking called nominalism. So Occam's Via Moderna, just means the modern way, also had a seriously damaging influence on our view of creation. Creation no longer must be good. It no longer had to reflect God's perfection, because creation arises from an arbitrary, that is, divine will. So he kind of introduces this arbitrariness where instead of things being objective, like this is wrong and this is right, he basically is saying, well, it is that this is wrong and this is right, but it could have been the other way. It could just as easily have been the other way, and there's nothing that says that it shouldn't have been. So he introduces this confusion, and his idea behind that was trying to liberate God's divine will, and kind of saying that God could have chosen this or that, and whatever God chooses becomes law. But it makes our laws, if that's how you view the 10 Commandments, that they could have been totally opposite, and that God could have willed that, it just doesn't make any sense. It leads us down a path of confusion, whereby the laws are not there to give us happiness, they're just there. They're just there. So Occam reverses the traditional relationship between freedom and nature. For him, freedom precedes nature. So freedom precedes nature, or what he is willing to call nature. Thus, free will precedes reason on the level of action, and so will is the first faculty of the human person. So he's kind of saying our freedom to choose is not predicated, it's not based on what is right and what's wrong. Our freedom to choose is just arbitrary. It comes first. Before we know what is right and wrong, there's nothing that's written in my heart, and not a human nature that's there that directs me one way or the other. It's just something I have to learn. It's arbitrary. What is right and what's wrong, it's just something I learn. So all the teachings of the church just become things I have to know, rules that I have to follow, and they're not really, it's not like a guidebook to happiness. It's not a guidebook to eternal life and union with God. It's just a set of rules to follow. And that's really damaging when we start to look at morality that way. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's not a lot of motivation to follow it. And it becomes more kind of like this sort of wrestling with my will and trying to create boundaries where I'm keeping myself from doing certain things and allowing myself to do other things. Instead of recognizing I'm moving towards happiness, these things are a guide to lead me to happiness, and I should follow them. So Occam defines freedom as the power to choose indifferently between two contraries. And that's the freedom of indifference. That's his definition of freedom. The freedom to choose indifferently between two contraries. So what's a contrary? Well, we could go back to the pornography thing. To look at or to not look at it. To be free is to be able to do either, and to do either in just as much freedom as one or the other. And freedom here, it could be one way or the other. It's fine one way or the other. To have freedom is to be able to choose one or the other. Now, freedom of excellence is, again, freedom to choose the good, right? So to choose the good. So it's telling us when we are free, we choose the good. So when I'm free, I don't choose pornography. I don't choose to look at it. I don't choose to use it. I choose to avoid it because I'm free. Freedom of excellence to choose the good. What is the good? It's the good that's going to lead me to happiness. Pornography offers some kind of happiness, but it does not lead to happiness, right? It leads me down a path whereby I am enslaved. And so freedom of indifference looks at it and says, to be free is to have the ability to choose one or the other. And to be able to choose that is freedom to me. Whereas freedom of excellence is to choose what is the good, is what true freedom is. Because free will is first, one can choose between being happy and not being happy. This is Occam again. There's no natural inclination to happiness. It is the matter of indifference. It is a matter of indifferent choice of the free will. Nature no longer orders freedom or happiness. Rather, the good is found in the choosing. This is the freedom of indifference. So it might seem subtle, it might seem confusing, but basically it's saying if my nature does not direct me towards what is good, if I don't have a nature that's written in my DNA or written in my person that directs me towards something that is good and to avoid certain things that are evil, if that doesn't exist, then it's purely knowledge that I need to know. This is wrong, this is right. I just have to align my will or align my knowledge really with what God has decided. But it could have been the complete opposite is what he's saying. And this creates confusion because then it's all about just being obedient, blindly obedient to something, what is told to me or which is expected of me, without any connection to that. This is going to lead me to happiness, that this is meant to lead me towards something that's good, ultimate good. So he kind of takes away that second component of leading me towards something good and happiness and so forth. And if we don't have that, then morality breaks down. The whole idea of how to come to know God falls apart. So there's lots of things that this begins to undermine society. So there's no longer a connection between the freedom of God and the freedom of the human person. We cannot discern good choices by understanding God and human nature. We are now reduced to obligation imposed by law. So again, Catholicism would say the more we know God and understand Him, the more we're going to be able to attain and achieve happiness because we're going to follow God. We're going to be drawn to God. And He's always going to lead us to what makes us happy because He created us, right? Whereas this says there's not a connection. We're reducing our morality basically to knowing the laws and following them without really understanding where they lead or why they were given to us. What's another way of putting this? You might say something like, if you were to walk in the woods and you found an old car that was kind of hidden in the woods, you might say, wow, look at this thing. What's it for? I don't know. It's just here. Versus understanding that, okay, there's this car here, And that means that somebody made it and they had a design in mind. They made it for what? For driving around. Depending on what kind of car it is, maybe it's a family car, or it's a truck. It's made for hauling things or working. So the designer had something in mind, and it's to accomplish something good, hopefully. Whereas if we just see it and we don't recognize that, we just say, oh, here's a car, it's metal, there's some tires, blah, 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 blah. And we don't really recognize its purpose, why it was created. We don't really understand anything about it. So it's kind of confusing in that way. So the law becomes increasingly arbitrary, meaning it doesn't have a lot of bearing on my day-to-day life. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't recognize in the laws exactly what it's about or why it is a certain way. Because happiness is divorced from nature and happiness must be redefined, happiness is now assumed to be achieved by freely choosing. Again, choosing between two arbitraries. That's kind of what they say leads us to happiness. To have that ability to choose, not just what is good, but its exact opposite too. That is happiness to me, because I have the power to choose. Therefore, obligation to follow law means that happiness sometimes has to be sacrificed to obligation. That's interesting, right? Therefore, obligation to follow law means that happiness sometimes has to be sacrificed to obligation. Isn't that what we see in our society today? Very often laws are an infringement or imposed upon my freedom to choose, and that keeps me from being happy. That's how we perceive laws very often. It keeps me from doing the thing that I want to do. It keeps me from attaining something that I want to attain. Isn't that what we see today very often? It's an obligation. I have to do it. I have to surrender my happiness. I mean, isn't that what about sex today, right? Sorry, there's a lot of things that deal with our human sexuality, but it's true. A lot of these things have a bearing on that part of our humanity. We see the church's laws as an infringement. You can't have sex outside of marriage? Oh man, that's no fun. That's taking all the joy out of life. You're taking all the fun away. Well, are we really? Are we really? Look at somebody's life who has chosen to have sex outside of marriage, before marriage, with many people maybe, and follow that train of life in the long term. Is that going to lead them to God? Is that going to lead them to true happiness? No. Those things, in fact, if they've been done, will have hurt somebody and perhaps be a barrier to them ever really attaining happiness in the realm of sexuality. They might be so wounded by these experiences that now, even when they're married and they're trying to live this out, they've been so wounded that they can't really do it, or they have a very difficult time doing it. Whereas if somebody has followed the laws of the church and has been faithful, it allows them then to really give themselves fully and to experience happiness in that realm of their sexual life with their spouse in a proper way. So this, it is sometimes hard to understand what is it all getting at, but it's this idea that freedom is meant to lead us to happiness, to goodness, and not just to infringe our choices. Obedience to law is emphasized in moral action as a response of love with the goal of happiness is pushed out of view. So if happiness has to be sacrificed, this sort of idea, obedience to the law is emphasized. We just got to follow the law. That's the law. There's not a reason why we follow the law. Like the law is leading us to eternal life. The law is leading us to happiness. Instead, it's just I got to follow the law. The moral action as a response of love with a goal of happiness is pushed out of view. So instead of having that as our viewpoint and our goal and our ultimate end, our viewpoint is much closer. It's much kind of more narrow, and we're kind of looking at something that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's like learning calculus in high school, where you're saying, what am I ever going to use this for? It doesn't make any sense. You don't understand what it's going to be used for. And Whereas if you're in college physics and you're trying to understand how an object in motion, like what is its velocity, what is its all the different things about that object that you might want to know in time and space, you need calculus to be able to calculate different things and kind of discern where it is in its trajectory and so forth. You need that. And if you're going to do high level physics or engineering, you need that. But in high school, when you're learning the principles of calculus, you might just sit there going, why do I need to learn this? This seems terrible. So it's kind of like that. Sometimes we don't understand why these laws are given or why there's things that are given, but it's when we get further down that they start to make sense. Okay, we're at 35 minutes, so we're pushing some time here, so I'm going to try to zoom through some of this. So this nominalist thinking gave rise to morality of obligation. Law now is viewed as necessary evil, rather than a guide to how to fulfill human nature. Occam's view of freedom was accepted by the Protestant reformers and institutionalized by philosophers like Immanuel Kant and his Ethics of Study. So there's some names that are basically just kind of tracing how this got to our day. Freedom of indifference forms the predominant view of freedom influencing the modern West. So our current culture right now is, unfortunately, freedom of indifference. That's how the world looks at freedom and says what freedom ought to be. Freedom to choose between two opposites. That is what we call freedom. Whereas the historically Christian perspective has always been freedom of excellence. Freedom to choose the good. So they're distinguishing those two things. For nihilistic postmodern modernism, there is nothing to perfect except social structures dedicated to the cult of choice. So basically what they're saying is, in our modern time, we try to create structures that allow us to choose, right? Pro-choice, perfect example. What is pro-choice? The choice to kill a child or to end a pregnancy or however they would word it to try to sterilize it. That is not leading us to happiness. That is not leading us to eternal life. That is not helping us. In a moment, it promises something, but it's not leading us to that. And so our society tries to create these structures that help us to choose, to have whatever choice we want. The whole idea of relativism, that nothing is absolutely true. These kind of ideas lead us down a path where we are, in a sense, put in a place where we're not giving direction. We're not led to happiness. We're not led to something. We're just kind of, here, do whatever you want and find out for yourself where it's going to lead. And oftentimes we choose wrong, we choose poorly, and we end up getting hurt. So that's the world that this is offering to us. Unfortunately, Catholics often fall into this disordered thinking. To this, Pinckaers, remember the guy that kind of helped develop again some of these thoughts and help us understand it in the more modern times. To this, Pinckaers responds that the need is great to rediscover and renew the understanding of the freedom for excellence to which the Holy Spirit constantly beckons us and offers us the grace to pursue and achieve. Excellence is what the human heart was created for, and it is the only true path to human happiness, because its end is Christ. So does this make sense? I hope this is making sense. I know it's been a long chat, long talk, but this is very, very important. It's very profound and very. It's very important for us as Catholics to understand this, because it underlies so many of our moral teachings. It underlines our whole perspective on the human person and what we're made for and how we're meant to live. If we are living out freedom of indifference, and that's how we live, is that for me the highest good is to be able to choose whatever I want. Something or its opposite. If